Close your eyes. Imagine a narrow street. Not a street like you know today, no concrete, no electric light, no hum of distant traffic. This street is unpaved, packed earth, flanked by low wooden buildings with paper screens glowing softly from within. Lanterns hang at intervals, swaying slightly in a night breeze. The smell of charcoal smoke, of rice cooking, of pine wood and rain-wet earth. The year is somewhere in the early 18th century. The place is Japan. Edo, the city we now call Tokyo, is one of the largest cities in the world. 1 million people packed into its streets and canals and districts, living under the rigid, orderly rule of the Tokugawa shogunate, a society of absolute hierarchy, samurai at the top, then farmers, then artisans, then merchants, and at the very bottom, the people who fell through the cracks entirely. And it is from those cracks, from the margins of that rigid, beautiful, violent society, that our story begins. Because it is from the forgotten people, the wandering gamblers and the traveling peddlers, the men and women whom respectable society had no use for, that one of the most powerful and enduring criminal organizations in human history would slowly, quietly grow. The Yakuza. Tonight, we follow that story from its very beginning. From the streets of Edo in the 18th century, through war and occupation and the chaos of a shattered Japan, through decades of extraordinary growth and political influence, all the way to the modern organization that still operates today, tattooed, ritualized, operating in the shadows of one of the most orderly societies on earth. It is a story unlike any other. So settle in, let the lantern light flicker, let the rain begin on the paper screen, and let Japan carry you gently to sleep. Part 1. The world that made the Yakuza. To understand the Yakuza, you first need to understand the Japan that created them. The Tokugawa shogunate, the military government that ruled Japan from 1603 until 1868, was one of the most controlled and orderly societies in human history. The shoguns had ended a century of civil war by imposing rigid, unyielding order on every aspect of Japanese life. Society was divided into 4 official classes: samurai, farmers, artisans, and merchants, and your class determined almost everything about your life: where you could live, what you could wear, who you could marry, what work you could do. The country was almost entirely closed to the outside world. Foreign trade was limited to a tiny Dutch outpost on a small artificial island in Nagasaki harbor. Christianity was banned. Leaving Japan was punishable by death. It was a society of extraordinary stability and extraordinary rigidity. And in any society that rigid, there are always people who don't fit. The samurai class had a problem as the centuries of Tokugawa peace wore on. The samurai were warriors, trained from birth in the arts of combat, expected to be ready to fight and die for their lord at any moment. But there were no wars. Decade after decade of peace meant that the samurai had nothing to do. Some adapted, becoming administrators, scholars, teachers, but others drifted. Warriors without wars, swords without battles. They wandered the roads of Japan, restless and purposeless. They were called ronin, literally, wave men, men who drifted like waves on the sea, belonging nowhere, serving no one. Some became bandits, some became bodyguards, some became something else entirely. And alongside the ronin, there was another group of people who didn't fit the official social order. The people whose work was considered spiritually unclean under Buddhist and Shinto beliefs: butchers, tanners, executioners, gravediggers. They were called burakumin, a word that still carries stigma in Japan today. They lived in separate communities, were forbidden from using the same wells or roads as other Japanese, were barely acknowledged as fully human by the society around them. And there were the traveling merchants, the peddlers who moved from town to town selling goods, who had no fixed place in the community hierarchy, who operated in the spaces between the settled, ordered world. It was from these margins, the ronin, the burakumin, the wandering merchants, the people the official society had no category for, that the Yakuza would emerge. Part 2. The gamblers and the peddlers. The direct ancestors of the modern Yakuza came from two distinct groups. The first were the tekiya, traveling merchants and peddlers. These were the men who set up stalls at temples and shrines during festivals, selling goods of variable quality to pilgrims and visitors. They operated in a world of fluid identity and sharp practice, a world where the provenance of goods was often unclear, where the line between legitimate commerce and fraud was blurry, and where a merchant needed protection from rivals and from the customers who might object to being sold something less than what it was described as. The tekiya developed their own internal organization early on. They had bosses, oyabun, literally parent role, and followers, koban, child role. This parent-child relationship, built on loyalty and obligation in both directions, would become the fundamental social structure of the Yakuza. The oyabun provided protection, resources, and a place in the organization. The koban provided loyalty, labor, and absolute obedience. It was modeled on the ideal of the Japanese family, hierarchical, warm, bound by duty rather than contract. The tekiya were eventually officially recognized by the Tokugawa government, which granted their bosses the right to carry swords, an extraordinary privilege normally reserved for the samurai class. They were given semi-official status as regulators of market stalls. The government understood in its pragmatic way that someone was going to organize these people, and it was better to bring them partially inside the system than leave them entirely outside. The second group were the Bakuto, the gamblers. Gambling was officially illegal in Tokugawa, Japan, but it was everywhere. The Bakuto ran illegal gambling dens, often in the outbuildings of temples and shrines, with the tacit permission of priests who received a cut of the proceeds. They traveled from town to town following the seasonal festivals, setting up their operations wherever crowds gathered and money changed hands. The Bakuto developed their own culture and their own rituals, some of which survive in the Yakuza to this day. The most famous is the game of Oicho Kabu, a card game played with traditional Japanese cards, in which the object is to draw cards totaling as close to 9 as possible. The worst possible hand in this game, a worthless combination of 8, 9, and 3, gives the Yakuza its very name. Yakuza 893. A hand worth nothing, men worth nothing. The name embraces the identity of the outcast, the man who has drawn the worst cards that society deals. It is, in its way, a remarkable act of self-definition. Part 3. The finger and the ink. The Bakuto also originated two of the most iconic practices associated with the Yakuza. The first is Ayazumi, the full-body tattoo. Tattooing in Japan has a complex history. At various points it was used as a punishment. Criminals were tattooed on the face or arms to mark them permanently as outcasts. The Bakuto took this stigma and inverted it. They began tattooing themselves voluntarily, elaborately, beautifully, covering their entire bodies in designs of extraordinary complexity and artistry. Dragons and koi fish and cherry blossoms and waves and tigers and demons, all rendered in the traditional Japanese style, in deep blacks and blues and reds, covering the torso, the arms, the legs, stopping at the neck and wrists and ankles so that a man could wear a kimono and appear entirely conventional. The tattoo was not merely decoration. It was a statement, a commitment. The process was agonizing, done with hand tools, needle by needle, taking years to complete and costing enormous sums of money. A man who submitted to that process was demonstrating his ability to endure pain, his belonging to the group, and his acceptance of a life outside conventional society. You could not easily change your mind about the Yakuza once your body was covered in its ink. The second practice is yubitsume, finger cutting. When a member of the Bakuto made a serious mistake or needed to apologize for a significant failing, he would cut off the tip of his little finger, wrap it carefully, and present it to his boss as an act of atonement. The origins of this practice are practical as well as symbolic. A missing finger joint weakens the grip, making it harder to hold a sword effectively. A man who had cut his finger was therefore more dependent on his group for protection. He had literally reduced his own ability to survive alone. Over time, repeated offenses meant additional joints removed. A Yakuza member who had made many mistakes or atoned for many failings might be missing several finger joints on one or both hands. These two practices, the tattoo and the finger cutting, became the visible signs of Yakuza identity. Signs that said, "I have committed myself to this life. I have paid for my place in this world in ink and in blood." Part 4. The organization takes shape. Through the 18th century and into the 19th, both the Tekiya and the Bakuto expanded and organized. The parent-child structure deepened into something more complex, a fully articulated hierarchy with the Oyabun at the top, senior advisors and lieutenants beneath him, and layers of younger members descending in order of seniority and responsibility. Each level had its duties and its privileges. Each member knew exactly where he stood, what he owed to those above him, and what those below him owed to him. Ceremonies were developed to mark entry into the group and advancement within it. The most important was the sake ceremony, the ritual sharing of cups of rice wine between Oyabun and Kobun, formalizing the parent-child bond. It was modeled on the ceremonies used in traditional Japanese weddings and adoptions, deliberately borrowing the vocabulary and the gravity of legitimate family rituals. When a man joined the Yakuza through this ceremony, he was not merely joining a criminal organization. He was being adopted into a family. His boss became his father. His fellow members became his brothers. The obligations ran in both directions, loyalty and obedience upward, protection and care downward. This familial model was not merely symbolic. It was the foundation of the organization's extraordinary resilience. An organization built on contract can be dissolved when the contract becomes inconvenient. An organization built on family obligation is much harder to leave, much harder to betray, and much harder to destroy. The groups expanded their territories. Competition between rival gangs was a constant feature of the period, sometimes resolved through negotiation, often through violence. The establishment of clear territorial boundaries and the protocols for resolving disputes across those boundaries became increasingly important. And a certain code of behavior began to crystallize. Not a written code, nothing so formal, but an understood set of values that defined what it meant to be a proper member of the group: courage, loyalty, the protection of the weak against the strong, a particular kind of honor among those who had no social honor. This last point is important. The Yakuza developed, as criminal organizations often do, a self-image of social justice, of being protectors of the common people against the powerful. Whether this image corresponded to reality was another matter, but the ideal was genuine and it shaped the organization's culture in ways that persist today. Part 5. The Twilight of the Shogunate. By the middle of the 19th century, the Tokugawa world that had created the Yakuza was coming apart. The arrival of American Commodore Matthew Perry in 1853, his black-hulled steam-powered warships anchoring in Edo Bay, demanding that Japan open itself to trade, shattered the illusion of Japanese isolation. The technological gap between Japan and the Western powers was suddenly, terrifyingly visible. The shogunate's inability to respond effectively to the foreign threat discredited it fatally. A movement to restore power to the emperor, who had been a largely ceremonial figure for centuries while the shoguns actually ruled, gathered momentum. In 1868, the Meiji Restoration overthrew the Tokugawa shogunate and restored imperial rule. Japan began the most extraordinary modernization program in history, within a generation, transforming itself from a feudal society to an industrial power capable of defeating China 1894 and Russia 1905 in wars. For the Yakuza, this transformation created both threats and opportunities. The official abolition of the samurai class in 1876, including the prohibition on wearing swords, removed the legal distinction between samurai and commoner that had underpinned the social hierarchy. The bureaucramen were officially emancipated. The rigid class structure of the Tokugawa period was dismantled. In theory, this should have reduced the conditions that created the Yakuza. In practice, it created new ones. The rapid industrialization of the Meiji period created enormous social dislocation. People flooded from the countryside into the new industrial cities. Traditional community structures broke down. Poverty, overcrowding, and social disruption created exactly the conditions in which criminal organizations flourish. The Yakuza adapted. They moved into the new cities. They diversified their activities, adding protection rackets, money lending, and labor contracting to their traditional gambling operations. And they found a new role that would define them through much of the 20th century. Part 6: The Political Connection. The Meiji period and its aftermath saw the Yakuza develop a relationship with political power that was both complex and enduring. The new Japanese state, in building its modern political and economic system, needed people who could do things that respectable institutions couldn't. Things like breaking up labor unions, intimidating political opponents, controlling crowds, managing the flow of workers to building sites and factories. The Yakuza could do all of these things. A symbiotic relationship developed between the criminal underworld and the political establishment that has characterized Japan ever since. Politicians hired Yakuza muscle for campaigns and rallies. Yakuza bosses cultivated political connections that provided protection from prosecution. The boundaries between legitimate business, criminal enterprise, and political activity became deliberately blurred. One figure from the early 20th century illustrates this relationship perfectly. Toyama Mitsuru was the leader of a nationalist organization called the Osha, the Dark Ocean Society, founded in 1881. It was simultaneously a political movement, a network of spies and agents operating in China and Korea, and an organization with deep roots in the criminal underworld. Toyama cultivated relationships with politicians, military men, and Yakuza bosses. He operated in the shadow world between legitimate nationalism and criminal enterprise. He mediated disputes between rival gangs and between the underworld and the state. He was, in many ways, the model for a figure that would recur throughout Japanese history, the man who moved comfortably between the legitimate and illegitimate worlds, who understood that power in Japan operated in the spaces between the official and the unofficial. Organizations like the Osha, ultranationalist, criminally connected, politically active, would play an increasingly significant role in Japanese life as the country moved toward the militarism of the 1930s. Part 7: War and Empire. The decades from 1905 to 1945 saw Japan become an imperial power of the first rank, and the Yakuza followed the empire wherever it went. As Japan expanded into Korea, Manchuria, China, and Southeast Asia, Yakuza-connected organizations moved in behind the military, establishing gambling operations, brothels, narcotics networks, and labor-contracting businesses in the conquered territories. The relationship between the Yakuza and the Japanese military was never simple. Sometimes they cooperated, sometimes they competed. Sometimes the line between military intelligence operations and Yakuza enterprise was almost impossible to draw. The opium trade in China and Manchuria is a particularly dark example. The Japanese military used opium, managed through nominally civilian organizations with deep Yakuza connections, as a tool of social control in occupied territories, deliberately addicting populations to weaken resistance. The profits flowed through networks that mixed state intelligence, military logistics, and organized crime in ways that have never been fully untangled. At home, the militarist governments of the 1930s used Yakuza muscle against political opponents, communists, labor organizers, liberal politicians who opposed military expansion. The Yakuza's traditional role as the muscle of conservative political interests made them useful tools for the increasingly authoritarian state. Some Yakuza members served in the military. Some military men moved into the Yakuza after leaving the armed forces. The flow between the two worlds was constant. And then, in August 1945, the atomic bombs fell on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Japan surrendered. And from the rubble of the defeated empire, the Yakuza rose to a power they had never previously approached. Part 8: The Chaos Years. The immediate aftermath of Japan's defeat was a period of extraordinary chaos. The country lay in ruins, major cities had been firebombed into rubble, the economy had collapsed, millions of soldiers and civilians were streaming home from the former empire, food was desperately short, the formal structures of government and law enforcement were shattered or discredited. American occupation forces under General Douglas MacArthur began the process of rebuilding and reforming Japan, dismantling the militarist state, writing a new constitution, breaking up the great industrial conglomerates, purging war criminals from public life. But in the immediate term, the occupation forces simply could not maintain order in every corner of the country. Into that vacuum stepped the Yakuza. The black market that emerged in the rubble of post-war Japan was one of the largest in history. Official food rations were inadequate, people were hungry, the black market fed them. And the black market was controlled by the Yakuza. Food, clothing, medicines, cigarettes, alcohol, American military surplus goods, construction materials, everything moved through Yakuza-connected distribution networks. The organization that had been a significant criminal presence before the war became, in the chaos of defeat, something close to an essential economic institution. Two figures dominate this period, and they could not be more different. The first is Yoshio Kodama. Kodama was an ultranationalist political operative who had worked as an agent for the Japanese Navy during the war, managing supply networks in China that were intimately connected with criminal enterprise. He was held by the American occupation as a Class A war crime suspect, someone potentially responsible for crimes against peace. He was eventually released without trial, and he emerged from Sugamo prison in 1948 with an extraordinary network of contacts in the Japanese underworld, in conservative politics, and eventually in American intelligence, which found his anti-communist connections useful in the context of the early Cold War. Kodama became the great fixer of post-war Japanese politics, the man who could connect politicians with money, who could resolve disputes between rival criminal organizations, who operated in the shadow world between the legitimate and the criminal with supreme confidence and skill. He helped unite the conservative political forces that would form the Liberal Democratic Party, the party that has governed Japan for most of the period since 1955, and cemented the relationship between that party and the Yakuza that would endure for decades. The second figure is Kazuo Tauka. Tauka was the boss of the Yamaguchi-gumi, a Yakuza organization based in the port city of Kobe that had been a significant regional power before the war. Under Tauka's leadership, beginning in 1946, the Yamaguchi-gumi expanded from a regional organization into a national one. Tauka was an extraordinary leader, physically powerful, personally charismatic, strategically brilliant. He understood that the chaos of the post-war period represented an unprecedented opportunity for expansion. He recruited aggressively, he moved into new territories, he diversified the organization's activities, he built alliances and crushed rivals with equal ruthlessness. By the time he died in 1981, the Yamaguchi-gumi was the largest criminal organization in Japan, and arguably the largest in the world. Part 9: The Economic Miracle and the Yakuza. Japan's economic recovery from the ruins of 1945 was one of the most extraordinary stories of the 20th century. By the 1960s, Japan was the world's second-largest economy. By the 1980s, its companies were buying American landmarks and its banks were the largest in the world. The Japanese economic miracle, built on manufacturing, technology, and the extraordinary discipline and dedication of the Japanese workforce, transformed a shattered country into a global superpower within a generation. The Yakuza grew with it. The construction boom that rebuilt Japan's cities was deeply penetrated by Yakuza-connected businesses, providing labor, materials, and the management of the disputes and violence that inevitably accompany large construction projects. The entertainment industry, nightclubs, bars, restaurants, the music and film businesses was similarly connected. The real estate market, particularly during the bubble economy of the 1980s, provided extraordinary opportunities for money laundering and speculation. But the Yakuza's most important economic role in the post-war period was not in any specific industry. It was as the provider of financial services to people and businesses that the legitimate economy wouldn't serve. The formal Japanese banking system was conservative, relationship-based, and deeply reluctant to extend credit to small businesses, new enterprises, or individuals without substantial collateral and established connections. This left an enormous gap. The Yakuza filled it. Loan sharking, lending money at extremely high interest rates to borrowers who had no other options, became one of the organization's most profitable activities. Small businesses in financial trouble, individuals with gambling debts, entrepreneurs with ideas but no banking relationships. The Yakuza would lend to them when no one else would, and when they couldn't repay, the Yakuza would take their businesses, their property, or their labor. It was a system of debt bondage dressed in the language of financial service, and it created an economic relationship between the Yakuza and ordinary Japanese people that was both exploitative and, from the perspective of people with no other options, sometimes genuinely useful. Part 10: The Code and the Culture. By the post-war period, the Yakuza had developed a culture of extraordinary richness and complexity. The Oyabun-Kobun relationship remained at the heart of everything. The ceremonies were elaborate and meaningful. The obligations were absolute. When a new member was initiated, the sake ceremony was conducted with great formality. The Oyabun and Kobun sat facing each other. A go-between, a senior member who had sponsored the new initiation, presented the cups. The ritual exchange of sake formalized the relationship. From that moment, the new member owed his Oyabun everything: his loyalty, his labor, his willingness to take risks, even his life if necessary. And the Oyabun owed his Kobun protection, support, a place in the world, and the kind of personal care and attention that the parent-child relationship implied. The code of conduct that governed Yakuza behavior, never written down, always transmitted through example and expectation, had several consistent elements. Courage was paramount. A Yakuza member was expected to be physically brave, to not flinch in confrontation, to not show weakness under pressure, to be willing to fight, and if necessary to die rather than betray his group. Loyalty was absolute. Betraying the organization, going to the police, cooperating with enemies, breaking the rules of the group was the worst thing a member could do. The consequences were severe. Some were killed. Others were expelled, cast out of the only family they had ever truly belonged to, which many members experienced as a fate almost worse than death. The protection of civilians was, at least in theory, a core value. The Yakuza were not supposed to prey on ordinary innocent people. Their activities were supposed to be directed at other criminal groups, at businesses and wealthy individuals, not at the vulnerable and helpless. This principle was regularly violated in practice, but its existence shaped the organization's self-image and, at times, its actual behavior. And there was a particular relationship with Japan itself, a fierce patriotism that expressed itself in ultranationalist politics, in opposition to communism, and in a romanticized identification with the traditional Japanese values of honor, discipline, and self-sacrifice. This last element had practical consequences. During periods of natural disaster, earthquakes, tsunamis, Yakuza organizations consistently provided emergency relief, sometimes faster and more effectively than the official government response. They distributed food and water, organized shelter, provided medical assistance. It was partly genuine altruism. It was partly excellent public relations. It was partly the expression of a genuine connection to the communities in which they operated. It was, in short, complicated, as the Yakuza itself was complicated. Part 11, The Great Bosses. The post-war Yakuza produced a series of extraordinary leaders whose personalities shaped the organization as much as any structural change. Kazuo Tauka of the Yamaguchi-gumi, whom we have already met, was perhaps the greatest of them. Called the Bear for his physical presence and strength, Tauka turned a regional organization into a national empire. He survived an assassination attempt in 1978, shot in the neck at a golf driving range. He reportedly grabbed the gun from his attacker before collapsing. He survived. His attacker did not. Tauka's management style was a mixture of extreme violence and genuine personal warmth. He remembered the names of every member's family. He attended weddings and funerals throughout the organization. He was, in the best and worst sense, a father to thousands of men who had few other fathers to turn to. Hisuyuki Machiai was a different kind of figure, a Korean-Japanese gangster who built the Tosaikai organization in Tokyo in the post-war chaos, establishing control over much of the entertainment district of Ginza. Machiai operated at the highest levels of political connection, with links to Korean intelligence and Japanese conservative politics that made him virtually untouchable for decades. His story illustrates the international dimensions of the Yakuza, an organization that was never purely Japanese, that operated across borders, and that connected the Japanese underworld to criminal and intelligence networks across Asia. And then there was Suzumu Ishii of the Inagawa Kai, a man who brought the Yakuza to its peak of financial sophistication during the bubble economy of the 1980s, moving the organization into real estate speculation, stock market manipulation, and complex financial schemes that made traditional criminal activities look crude by comparison. These men were not simply criminals in the conventional sense. They were executives of extraordinarily complex organizations, managing thousands of employees, navigating complex political relationships, maintaining codes of conduct and dispute resolution mechanisms that had more in common with large corporations than with street gangs. Which is, in some ways, exactly what the Yakuza had become. Part 12, The Bubble and the Bust. The 1980s were the golden age of the Yakuza. Japan's bubble economy, in which land prices and stock values rose to levels that, in retrospect, were clearly insane, created extraordinary opportunities for criminal enterprise. The Yakuza moved into real estate speculation with the enthusiasm and the access to capital that legitimate businesses could only envy. They perfected the art of Jaya land shark operations. When a developer wanted to build on land occupied by residential tenants who refused to sell, the Yakuza would be hired to make life uncomfortable for the holdouts. Harassment, intimidation, threats, all calibrated to just below the level that would bring serious police intervention. Eventually, the tenants would sell. They moved into the financial markets. Yakuza-connected investors would acquire significant stakes in companies, then use threats of disruption at shareholder meetings to extort payments from management. It was called Sokya, the hijacking of shareholders' meetings, and it was so widespread in Japanese corporate culture that most major companies quietly paid the required sums rather than face the consequences. They laundered money through golf courses, resort developments, restaurants, and entertainment businesses in enormous quantities. And they lent money to legitimate businesses facing cash flow problems, to real estate developers who needed bridge financing, to anyone who needed capital quickly and couldn't wait for a bank. When the bubble burst in 1990 and land prices and stock values collapsed, the Yakuza were exposed alongside everyone else. But unlike legitimate businesses, they had ways of recovering their loans that banks did not. The collapse of the bubble economy and the long deflationary stagnation that followed Japan's lost decade, which stretched into two, transformed the Yakuza's economic position. Many of the profitable activities of the bubble years vanished. Competition intensified. The organization began to experience pressures it had not faced before. Part 13, The State Strikes Back. For most of the post-war period, the Japanese state had maintained an ambiguous relationship with the Yakuza. They were tolerated, their offices operated openly with nameplates on the door, their bosses gave press interviews, their membership was publicly known. The reasoning was pragmatic. The Yakuza controlled crime. They provided a degree of order in the underworld, suppressing the kind of random, chaotic street crime that makes ordinary people feel unsafe, channeling criminal activity into controlled, predictable forms. The police knew who was responsible for what. The lines of accountability were clear. This uneasy coexistence began to break down in the 1990s. A series of violent incidents, particularly the open gang war between rival Yakuza factions in the Namba district of Osaka, in which ordinary civilians were caught in the crossfire, shifted public opinion. The Organized Crime Countermeasures Law of 1992 was the first serious legal attempt to restrict Yakuza activity. It designated certain organizations as Boryokudan violence groups and imposed restrictions on their activities. Members of designated organizations could be banned from opening bank accounts, signing leases, or engaging in a range of legitimate business activities. The laws were tightened repeatedly in the years that followed. By the 2010s, the legal environment for Yakuza activity in Japan had transformed fundamentally. Banks refused to open accounts for known Yakuza members. Golf courses refused their membership. Apartments refused to rent to them. The ordinary infrastructure of modern life, the things that everyone else took for granted, became progressively unavailable to Yakuza members. This created a paradox. The new laws were remarkably effective at disrupting the Yakuza's legitimate business operations, the front companies, the real estate holdings, the entertainment businesses. But they also pushed the organization's activities further underground, away from the semi-open existence that had made them relatively manageable. And membership began to decline. The Yakuza at their peak in the early 1960s numbered perhaps 185,000 members. By the 2020s, estimates suggested fewer than 28,000. The organization was smaller, but it was not gone. Part 14, The International Reach. From the 1970s onward, the Yakuza extended their operations beyond Japan's borders. Hawaii was an early focus, a natural bridge between Japan and the United States, with a large Japanese-American population and a tourist economy that created opportunities for gambling, prostitution, and money laundering. Yakuza-connected businesses established footholds in Honolulu that would persist for decades. The mainland United States followed. California, with its large Japanese community and its entertainment industry, became a significant area of Yakuza activity. The connection between the Yakuza and the American entertainment business, particularly in the financing of films, was investigated repeatedly, though prosecutions were rare. The Philippines became a major base of operations, particularly for sex tourism and trafficking, industries that the Yakuza developed with a ruthlessness and scale that caused enormous human suffering and brought international attention and condemnation. Australia, with its casinos and its proximity to Asia, became another significant area of activity. In Southeast Asia, Thailand, Cambodia, Vietnam, Laos, Yakuza-connected networks operated in narcotics, trafficking, and illegal gambling, often in areas where state authority was weak and corruption high. The international operations were never as dominant as the domestic ones. The Yakuza was always at its core a Japanese organization rooted in Japanese culture and society. Its international activities were extensions of the domestic business, not replacements for it. But the international reach demonstrated something important, that the organization had the sophistication, the connections, and the management capability to operate across borders, in different languages and legal systems, in ways that most criminal organizations simply could not. Part 15: The Disaster Response. One of the most extraordinary chapters in Yakuza history is their response to natural disasters. When the Great Hanshin earthquake struck the Kobe area in January 1995, killing over 6,000 people, injuring hundreds of thousands more, destroying entire neighborhoods, the official government response was slow and confused. The Yakuza response was immediate. The Yamaguchi-gumi, headquartered in Kobe, mobilized within hours. Trucks loaded with food, water, blankets, and medical supplies were dispatched to the affected areas. Yakuza members organized distribution points, managed crowds, coordinated with local community leaders. They were distributing supplies in the affected areas before the government's relief operation was fully organized. Journalists who documented the response were struck by the efficiency and genuine care with which the operation was conducted. This was not performance. The cameras were not invited. This was an organization responding to a crisis in its home city with the resources and the organizational capability it had available. The same pattern repeated itself after the Tohoku earthquake and tsunami of March 2011, the most powerful earthquake ever recorded in Japan, which triggered the Fukushima nuclear disaster. Yakuza organizations in the affected regions again provided early relief, food, water, supplies, and some Yakuza-connected businesses sent workers to assist with the Fukushima cleanup, in conditions of significant radiation exposure. These responses did not redeem the Yakuza for the harm they caused, but they illustrated something important about the organization's relationship with Japanese society, a relationship that was never simply predatory, that involved genuine community ties and genuine mutual obligation, however tangled with exploitation and violence. Part 16: The Yakuza Today. The Yakuza of today is a diminished and changing organization. The legal pressure of the past 3 decades has had real effects. Membership is down dramatically. Revenue from traditional activities, gambling, loan sharking, construction, entertainment, has been squeezed by law enforcement and by competition from less organized criminal networks. The organization has responded in several ways. Some factions have moved further into legitimate business, using the skills and capital accumulated over decades to operate in construction, real estate, and entertainment through front companies that are increasingly difficult to distinguish from legitimate enterprises. Others have moved deeper into cybercrime, fraud, and financial manipulation, activities that are harder to police, that cross international borders, and that don't require the kind of physical presence that makes traditional Yakuza activities visible and vulnerable to law enforcement. Internal conflicts have intensified. The Yamaguchi-gumi, still the largest organization, split dramatically in 2015 when a significant faction broke away to form the Kobe Yamaguchi-gumi. The split and the violence that accompanied it was a sign of the strains within an organization trying to maintain its traditional structures in a rapidly changing environment. The tattoos are less common now among younger members. The very visibility that once marked belonging and commitment now creates practical problems in a legal environment where Yakuza membership itself triggers restrictions. The finger cutting is rarer. The sake ceremonies continue. The organization persists. Smaller than it was, more hidden than it was, under more legal pressure than it has ever faced. But not gone. Part 17: Why the Yakuza Survived. The question that historians and criminologists keep returning to is why. Why did the Yakuza survive and thrive in Japan when similar organizations in other countries were suppressed? Why did an organization rooted in the 18th century persist into the 21st? Why does it continue even now, when the legal environment has made its traditional activities enormously difficult? Several answers present themselves. The first is the familial structure. The Oyabun-Koban relationship created bonds of obligation and loyalty that were extraordinarily resilient. Men who had been adopted into the Yakuza family, who had found in it the warmth and belonging that the outside world had not provided, were not going to leave simply because the government made their activities more difficult. The social bonds were stronger than the economic calculation. The second is the relationship with Japanese society. The Yakuza did not exist in opposition to Japanese society in the way that criminal organizations in other countries often do. They were woven into it, shared its values of hierarchy, loyalty, discipline, and obligation, provided services, however exploitative, that the legitimate economy and the legitimate state did not provide, had deep roots in communities, in political networks, in business relationships that centuries of coexistence had built. The third is the political connection. The relationship between the Yakuza and conservative Japanese politics, the Liberal Democratic Party, the business establishment, the networks of power that have governed Japan for most of the post-war period, provided protection and legitimacy that insulated the organization from the full force of the state for decades. That protection has eroded significantly, but it never entirely vanished. The fourth is the code. The culture the Yakuza developed, the rituals, the tattoos, the finger cutting, the sake ceremonies, the elaborate hierarchy, the sense of honor and belonging, created an identity so powerful and so complete that it gave men a reason to belong that went beyond the purely economic. For men who had grown up on the margins, who had found no place in the legitimate world, who had been told by that world that they were worthless, the Yakuza offered something that the legitimate world could not. A family, a place, a name. Yakuza 893. The worst hand in the game. But a hand that for 250 years has found ways to play. Closing, the lantern goes out. And so the story of the Yakuza comes to rest. 250 years, From the gambling dens of Edo, where men played cards by lamplight and called themselves by the name of a worthless hand, to the skyscrapers of modern Tokyo, where men in expensive suits manage organizations of extraordinary complexity from offices that don't announce what they are. The world changed around them again and again. The shogunate fell, the empire rose and fell. Japan was bombed to rubble and rebuilt into a global economic power. Laws were passed, bosses died and were succeeded. Wars were fought between rival factions in the streets of Kobe and Osaka. And the organization endured. Not because it was good. It was not good. It caused enormous suffering, exploited vulnerable people, enriched itself through violence and fear, and corrupted institutions that should have been beyond its reach. But because it filled a space that nothing else filled, because it gave belonging to the people who belonged nowhere, because it offered, in its dark and complicated way, a kind of family to the people the world had decided were not worth having. There is something in that which is worth sitting with for a moment. Not admiring, not excusing, but understanding. Because the Yakuza was not created in spite of Japanese society. It was created by Japanese society, by the people it excluded, by the needs it left unmet, by the cracks in its perfect, rigid surface through which certain kinds of people inevitably fell. Every society has its cracks, and something always grows in them. Let those thoughts settle now, like lantern smoke on a still night. Let the images grow quiet, the paper screens, the gambling dens, the tattooed backs, the sake cups, the cranes of Kobe, the trucks moving through the earthquake rubble. Let the names drift away, Tauka, Kodama, Machiai, Ishiai. There are no more cards to play tonight. No more bets to make, no more loyalty to swear. Only the night and the rain on the roof and the long quiet dark. And sleep, soft, deep, dreamless sleep. Good night.